People often call selfishness honesty when it arrives dressed in modern language. They call it growth, freedom, expansion, emotional evolution, or some other polished phrase meant to make appetite sound brave. That is one of the more reliable habits of arrogant people. They do not merely want permission to betray the structure they promised to honor. They want admiration for having the nerve to redefine it. And if you are married to someone like that, the most revealing moment is rarely when they first ask for more. It is when life refuses to flatter the script they wrote for themselves. That is when the truth begins to separate itself from performance. Not with noise. Not with victory. With consequence. I learned that later than I should have, which is true of most important things. For a long time, I believed restraint had a way of clarifying itself. I thought if a man stayed steady, measured, and willing to think before reacting, then the people closest to him would understand what they were standing in front of. That was one of my blind spots. Another was worse because it sounded dignified. I believed my refusal to compete theatrically for emotional ground somehow protected me from being underestimated. It did not. Quiet men are often misread first and understood last. And if they marry someone whose ego depends on being the emotional center of the room, that misreading eventually becomes the foundation of a very expensive mistake. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 48 years old, and until about a year and a half ago I had been married for 16 years to a woman named Erin. We lived outside Austin, in one of those professionally landscaped neighborhoods where every third household looked like a brochure for stable adulthood. 2-story houses, broad driveways, expensive grills no one used enough, children's bikes fading near side fences, and married couples carrying private dissatisfaction with the polished caution of people who thought image still had a moral claim over truth. We had one daughter in college and one son finishing high school. I worked in enterprise risk and continuity planning for a healthcare data company, which meant failure mapping, vendor exposure, operational resilience, scenario planning, and all the invisible work required to keep systems intact when people with more charisma than judgment made fragile decisions. I liked that kind of work because reality, however delayed, still had rules. You could sell optimism to a board for 6 months, maybe a year. Eventually, though, the system either survived stress or it didn't. At home, I gave improvisation far too much moral credit. Erin worked in boutique fitness brand development. She had the kind of social confidence that looked effortless to people who weren't paying close attention. Sharp, attractive, emotionally agile. Very skilled at making a room feel as though it had become more alive the moment she entered it. When we met, I admired that. I was steadier, more inward, more likely to observe first and speak later. She brought motion. I brought gravity. That kind of pairing often feels like balance in the early years, especially if both people are still disciplined enough to respect what they do not naturally possess. And for a while we did. I do not tell this story as if the marriage were false from the beginning. It was not. There had been real tenderness between us. Real loyalty too for years. We built a life. We moved twice, cared for aging parents, survived one near bankruptcy year in the early stages of my career, and made it through the ordinary erosion of ease that comes when children, deadlines, illness, bills, and grief all begin living in the same house. We had rituals. Friday takeout. Sunday grocery runs. Bad vacation photos. Shared private jokes that made no sense outside the marriage. All of that was real. That matters because betrayal hurts differently when it grows inside something that once deserved your faith. If I'm going to tell this honestly, I need to say something about my own role that doesn't flatter me. I took too much pride in being stable. Not boastful pride. Quiet male pride. The kind that says, I don't need applause, I don't need drama, I don't need anyone to notice the weight I'm carrying. I handled the mortgage, the retirement allocations, the insurance, the home repairs, the college funds, the passwords, the emergency reserve, the tax preparation folders, the 1,000 unglamorous details that keep a household feeling normal. I did it because I was good at it and because someone had to. But usefulness, when offered too consistently, teaches the wrong people the wrong lesson. They stop seeing the work. They start treating the outcome as weather. Then, if they are vain enough, they begin calling the climate boring. That is what happened with Erin. She never used the word boring in the early years. First it was safe. Then predictable. Then a little too comfortable inside structure. Those phrases sound benign when isolated. They are not benign when repeated over years in the same emotional direction. They become a theory about who is alive and who is merely reliable. A theory about who is expansive and who is somehow spiritually smaller because he does not need constant novelty to feel real. That shift matters, because once a spouse begins seeing your steadiness as a limitation rather than a gift, they start narrating their own restlessness as insight rather than appetite. The first time Erin mentioned opening the marriage, she did it in the language people now use when they want selfishness to sound morally current. We were in the kitchen on a Thursday night. Our son was at a friend's house. Our daughter was already away at school. Erin had been more socially alive for months. More late industry dinners, more networking weekends, more references to people we'd never met who sounded permanently interesting in the way superficial adults often sound when someone wants to borrow their energy. She leaned against the kitchen island and said, "Have you ever wondered whether monogamy is just fear dressed as tradition?" I remember setting my glass down very carefully because I had already learned that when someone begins a conversation with a sentence like that, they are rarely asking a real question. They are introducing a moral framework designed to make the next thing they say sound courageous. I said, "That depends who's asking." She smiled in that bright, composed way she had when she thought she was about to say something more evolved than the room deserved. "I think we've outgrown a narrow model of marriage," she said. There it was. Not a confession. Not yet. Not even a request in the direct sense. A reclassification. She wasn't saying I want permission to behave badly. She was saying the thing you think is betrayal has become, in my language, growth. That is what arrogance does when it has had time to intellectualize its appetite. It does not merely ask for indulgence. It tries to downgrade your existing standards into evidence of emotional immaturity. I did not react dramatically. Not because I wasn't shaken. Because a long marriage teaches you that once someone is using philosophical language to destabilize ordinary commitments, emotion alone won't serve you well. I asked what exactly she meant. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes about honesty, freedom, non-possessiveness, how mature love should not depend on restriction, how some of the strongest couples she knew had reimagined the old rules. She spoke fluently, which is often a warning sign in situations like that. People who arrive at difficult truths honestly tend to sound a little frightened by them. People who have been rehearsing a self-serving position tend to sound ready for a panel discussion. I asked if there was already someone in mind. She paused, then laughed softly and said, "Why does it always have to be about cheating with you?" That line told me enough. Because I had not said cheating. She had. Which meant the word was already in the room, alive somewhere between us, and she knew it. Still, I did what careful men often do when they are not yet ready to believe the ugliest explanation. I treated it like a disturbing conversation rather than an active betrayal. I told her I wasn't interested. I told her marriage was either structured or it wasn't. I told her rebranding appetite did not impress me. She rolled her eyes and said, "That's exactly what I mean. You think boundaries are character." Then she left the room. That sentence stayed with me because it revealed the hierarchy she had built privately. In her mind, my standards were not evidence of seriousness. They were evidence of limitation. Once a spouse starts viewing your principles as quaint, the marriage has already moved into more dangerous territory than either of you may be admitting. The next several months were a study in asymmetry. Erin did not drop the subject. She changed tactics. She became warmer on days when she felt me pulling away emotionally, colder when I asked questions too directly. She referenced friends whose relationships had become more open, more honest, more adult. She described traditional marriage as a structure built on ownership and fear. She also became more secretive, though she would have rejected that word violently if I had used it. More late nights, more withheld phone angle, more selective brightness, more emotional distance dressed as self-discovery. There was, of course, another man. His name was Julian. He ran a wellness investment group that funded boutique concepts in Erin's industry. I met him once at a launch party. Older than her by perhaps 8 years, smooth in the highly curated way rich men often are, good posture, low voice, the sort of calm that depends less on wisdom than on having enough money to let impatience arrive politely. Aaron described him afterward as actually interested in ideas instead of routines, which was revealing because it positioned me, without saying it outright, as a man of routines rather than ideas. In other words, the husband had become infrastructure. The new man represented possibility. I noticed the pattern long before I named it. More references to Julian than were necessary. More conversations that began as business and ended nowhere visible. More working dinners. More hotel bars showing up in expense categories that should not have contained them. Nothing dramatic enough that I could expose it without appearing, at first glance, small and suspicious. That is one of the advantages selfish people rely on. They know decent spouses hate looking paranoid more than liars hate being careful. If I am being honest, I should say that part of me wanted to believe her open marriage argument was still only theoretical because that would have let me keep some dignity without making any decisions. That is the danger of restraint without clarity. It can become a waiting room for your own humiliation. The first moment I knew, truly knew, came through our son. Not because he discovered the affair exactly, but because children feel structural dishonesty before adults admit its meaning. One Saturday morning he came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and asked, "Are you and Mom doing some kind of weird separation thing?" I turned and looked at him. "What makes you ask that?" He shrugged in that teenage way that pretends indifference while hoping not to be lied to. "She doesn't really come home like she lives here anymore." That sentence cut deeper than any receipt could have, because it was not romantic evidence. It was atmospheric evidence. The lie had already spread beyond adult privacy and into the emotional weather of the house. Our son didn't need details. He just knew his mother's center of gravity had moved somewhere else while her body still technically occupied our address often enough to preserve appearance. I asked how long he had felt that way. He said, "A while." That was the moment I stopped arguing with my own interpretation. I met with an attorney before I confronted Aaron. Her name was Michelle Givens, late 60s, composed, dry, unimpressed by modern language that tried to make selfishness sound therapeutic. I told her everything: the affair suspicion, the open marriage conversations, the child noticing, the account patterns, the way Aaron seemed to believe the moral burden of adapting belonged entirely to me. Michelle listened, folded her hands, and said, "He wants freedom. She wants insulation. That's usually what this means." That sentence clarified more than the entire previous year had. Because Aaron did not merely want permission to see someone else. She wanted the marriage to remain intact enough to absorb the cost while she explored whether another life felt larger. She wanted our house, our money structure, our son's stability, my practical competence, and the emotional credit of being honest about wanting more. In other words, she wanted me to finance both versions of her life at once. The turning point came 2 weeks later. She came home late from what she called a strategy dinner. She kicked off her shoes in the entryway, walked into the kitchen, and found me sitting at the table with the bank statements, hotel charges, rideshare logs, and printed messages from the synced tablet she had forgotten was still linked to the family cloud. She stopped moving. Then she said, too carefully, "What is this?" I looked at her and answered with the calm I had spent months earning. "It's the part where your theory meets sequence." That line surprised even me, but it was accurate. The issue was no longer whether she wanted a more evolved form of marriage. The issue was whether her behavior could survive contact with actual order. She sat down slowly, looked through the pages. Then came the predictable sequence. It wasn't what I thought. It began emotionally. She had felt unseen for years. Julian made her feel expanded. Nothing about traditional marriage had prepared her for how trapped she'd become. All the usual language. Some of it may even have been sincere in fragments. Many betrayers tell partial truths about their dissatisfaction. What matters is what they build around that dissatisfaction and what they demand from others in its name. Then she said the line that ended the whole experiment for me. "You can't expect me to apologize for wanting to live more honestly." No. I didn't expect her to apologize for wanting anything. I expected her not to build honesty on top of deceit and then act intellectually superior about it. I said, "This isn't openness. It's entitlement with better branding." That, I think, was the moment the truth was revealed. Not only that there was another man, but why the marriage had become what it had. Erin believed her desire for expansion had a higher moral status than my right to stability. She thought naming her appetite philosophically upgraded it into courage. She thought my refusal meant fear. In short, she had built the entire structure on one flattering misconception: that I was the smaller one. She moved out within a month. At first she lived in a luxury short-term rental Julian helped arrange, which told me all I needed to know about how independent her freedom actually was. Then came the practical unraveling. Not dramatic. Practical. That is how reality does its best work. Julian was separated, not fully divorced, and his finances were not as fluid as he looked. His investment group had leverage issues on 2 projects. The generosity that feels expansive in restaurants and weekend hotels begins looking narrower when legal fees, support obligations, and market timing start pressing in. Erin, meanwhile, discovered what many restless spouses only understand after leaving. The marriage had been carrying more of their life than they had ever bothered to learn. The money problem started small. Health insurance. Her first independent quarterly tax estimate. The cost of the furnished rental. A credit utilization issue she did not understand because I had always understood it for us. Car registration she forgot and then panicked about. A payroll withholding error that left her short 1 month. Then larger things. Her own apartment security deposit. A delay in Julian sorting out a promised investment in a concept she'd hoped to launch. A vacation they had discussed suddenly becoming bad timing. That is one of the ugliest little shocks for people like Erin. Discovering that the big, alive world they thought they were stepping into is often just another structure, only this time without your quiet competence holding up the floor. She called me more than once. At first about paperwork. Then about taxes. Then about our son's school account because she'd forgotten the payment rhythm and thought the tuition portal had glitched. None of those calls were romantic. That is what made them revealing. She was not reaching for love. She was reaching for the infrastructure she had mistaken as passive. About 6 months after she left, she said something that finally completed the lesson. We were standing in the parking lot after our son's orthodontist appointment. She had just finished a strained call about a payment issue and looked more tired than polished for the first time in a long while. She said, "I didn't realize how much you handled." That sentence always sounds satisfying when people imagine it from the outside. It wasn't satisfying. It was sad. Because what she meant was not "I understand your character more deeply now." She meant "I have encountered the cost structure of real life without your insulation, and it has corrected my fantasies more effectively than love ever could." I said, "That was the whole problem." And it was. The problem was never simply that she wanted someone else. The problem was that she built a moral story in which wanting more made her larger, while the man who had made ordinary life livable became spiritually smaller by comparison. She thought opening the marriage, or rather trying to force me into an arrangement that would let her betray it while feeling progressive, proved she was brave and I was afraid. What it actually proved was simpler and much less flattering. She had confused appetite with courage and patience with weakness. Julian faded after that, not because there was some dramatic betrayal on his end, but because men like him often lose their mystique once they are required to participate in ordinary consequence. Charm and money go a long way in dim restaurants. They go much less far in tax season. Our divorce finalized calmly. Our son adjusted, though not without cost. Our daughter never fully forgave her mother's language around the whole thing, which I understood. Children can forgive desire more easily than they forgive arrogance, especially the kind of arrogance that asks everyone else to applaud while the structure is being weakened. A year later, Erin said something to me after our son's graduation party, while relatives were still carrying folding chairs back toward their cars. "I thought you'd break," she said. I looked at her and answered as honestly as I could. "No. You just thought patience was weakness because it didn't look like you." That is the message I carry from all of this. People who push to open a marriage after trust has already become uneven are often not asking for honesty. They are asking for a moral rebranding of their own asymmetry. They want freedom without losing the shelter of the person they are betraying. They want to call it evolution so they do not have to call it entitlement. And because many calm, loyal spouses hate spectacle, they mistake our hesitation for helplessness. That is where they fail. Not because the quiet spouse wins. There is nothing to win in losing a marriage. But the truth has a way of revealing itself once consequences begin moving through ordinary life. Who understood bills? Who understood time? Who understood children, cost, insurance, structure, repair? Who understood that desire and design are not the same thing? Who understood that saying something boldly does not make it mature? She thought I was weak because I did not perform my strength in the style she admired. I was just patient enough to let reality do the speaking.